Okay, today we're going to take a look at the typography workshop at the second half of the material studies. In the first years of the Bauhaus at Weimar, typography did not yet play a central role. It was later to take on. For Johannes Itten and Lothar Schreier, calligraphy was essentially an artistic means of expression. So in other words, if you were going to do calligraphy, you would do it pen and ink, and you would, create a very specific kind of fine art sort of expression versus communication expression. At first, practical fields of application remained seldom and were restricted to small and miscellaneous printed matters. Then came Herbert Bayer. He was born in Austria. He was a Bauhaus member from 1921 to 1928. After 1925, he headed the workshop for the printing and advertising of the Bauhaus. And in 1938, he emigrates to New York. Moholy Nagy and Bayer struck up an important relationship. When Moholy Nagy was appointed in 1923, he was to introduce the ideas of new typography to the Bauhaus. The situation radically changed. He considered typescript to be a primary means of communication medium as we know it today, and was concerned with the clarity of the message in its most emphatic form. His influence is clearly visible already in 1923 in an advertising campaign for the large Bauhaus exhibition of the summer of 1923. And there we can see he actually takes the typeface that they created and photographs it for one of the booklets that they put out. He designs the layout for the exhibition publication and further took over the typography of what was known as the Bauhaus books. From then on, typography at the Bauhaus was closely connected to corporate identity and to the development of an unmistakable image for the school. So just like we saw with Behrens, and where, of course, Gropius had studied under Behrens and had understood this idea of corporate identity. And so when we think about this whole big picture, the thread is unmistakable. As we move through the arts and crafts movement, this idea of new art all across Europe and beyond. And then we have World War I, and we have all of these people coming back to their homes and thinking about what it means to be, in the world and to be an artist and to communicate. And so the communication piece is integral. Characteristic for the designs were clear. Unadorned type prints, the articulation and accentuation of pages through distinct symbols or typographic elements highlighted in color, and finally, direct information in the combination of text and photography. And they actually had a name for this. They called it typophoto, and typophoto was created. So the title of the School of the Bauhaus at Weimar, 1919 to 1923, was a letterpress print. In addition, in the consideration of economic factors led to the usage of unadorned formats, a largely simplified spelling, and more particularly the abolition of capitalization. Now, we don't see that in this cover, but we definitely see it in the interior. Here's a design that's very popular by the Bauhaus. Just Schmidt was a successor at the Bauhaus. He introduced a systematic course for the design of lettering and advertising and graphics, and expanded it to the practice of exhibition design. So that meant that when they would have an art exhibition, they would have a design for the show, and there would be posters and other things that would accompany it. Examples of the applicability of experimental forms of presentation in architecture, sculpture, photography, and typography were presented in the Bauhaus traveling exhibitions that would go to other places, including conventions in and outside of Germany. The stands were designed by the advertising workshop. And there we can see the color poster of this exhibition for Weimar in 1923. So this was really exciting stuff. In Weimar, next to Moholy-Nagy, both Juice Schmidt and Herbert Bayer had been concerned with typography. But by the time they get to Dessau, when they move the school and they create the new school in Dessau, Bayer took over the newly installed workshop for printing and advertising and rapidly transformed it into a professional studio for graphic design. He intensively developed avant-garde typesetting, and his posters and printed matter show a concern with contemporary themes from the psychology of advertising. Following his departure from the Bauhaus in 1928, Bayer continues to work at first in Germany and later in the United States, and becomes one of the most influential graphic designers of the 20th century. And when we look at Bayer later on, we're going to look at kind of what happened after the Bauhaus to many of these artists. We're going to see that Bayer, especially, moves into, huge, influential graphic design across the world. The Bauhaus favored the use of sans serif typeface, so there was no little serif hooks, even though you notice that in the display font of the PowerPoint font, I'm using a typeface that has serifs. But if you look at in the image, you can see there are no serifs in the display font. And this was heavily frowned upon by most of Germany, which preferred heavy black letter, complicated Gothic font. That was what was popular in Germany. This font, which looked older and more formal, had been used traditionally in German printing, but was difficult to read, a trait that some Bauhaus teachers disliked. This led the teacher, Laszlo Moholy-Nagy, to create a font design and theory on fonts formatted, which was published in the Bauhaus book of Weimar from 1919 to 1923, a book of typesetting and typography just for the Bauhaus. Here's a second book. There's 14 of these in all, and each of the covers is designed by different Bauhaus teachers. And of course, this one, very simple, is looking at painting and the pedagogy of painting by Paul Klee. This one is designed by Adolf Meyer, who is an architect. Remember, he had started a firm with Gropius early on, before the Bauhaus. Again, we have one photograph, very simple type, our letter of the volume. Of course, this one is Oskar Schlemmer, and they're Mim Bauhaus, Die Bund. And there we have one of our sort of futuristic human forms. And again, I've printed these out of an old book that I had and scanned them, so they're not like the greatest scans, but they're there. Here's another by Laszlo Moholy-Nagy. Again, just some graphic, lines. And then look at the way the font is like placed diagonally. And then of course, this is Piet Mondrian. And of course, Mondrian's artwork was what we call plastique. It had like taken things all the way back to this oversimplification. There's our number 5. The next one is Theo van Doesburg, who was one of the teachers in the Arts and Crafts School, and had come back and done some things with at Weimar. And that's where he had taught originally. The Weimar Bauhaus was not that. It was an arts and crafts school that was run by him. Here's another by Moholy-Nagy. Look at the large number. Here's another introducing photography and Moholy-Nagy. Very interesting. And this is photography and film. That was, the content of the book. Here's another by Herbert Meyer. Again, looking at this sort of oversimplification of page style. Lots of white space, lots of open space. Here's another by Moholy-Nagy talking about the new school and the interior and so on. Here's another. Really simple. one of my favorites, this one, where it's sort of reflecting on itself. As you see the shadow behind, and then this like half print that's they use for the 14. It's just wonderful. So typography is an instrument of communication. It must communicate clearly in the most urgent form. Clarity must be emphasized because in comparison with prehistoric photographs, or pictographs rather, oh, I said photographs, it is the essence of script. Our intellectual attitude to the world is individually precise. This individual, so that means we each have a different attitude. This individual precision is today changing to collective precision. In other words, that we're thinking alike, as opposed to the old individually and later collectively amorphous forms. Therefore, above all, unambiguous clarity in all typography is incredibly important to him. Legibility, communication must never be allowed to suffer for an aesthetic code adopted in advance. So here we can see it was this kind of thinking that inspired the simpler, less formal, and imposing fonts of the Bauhaus, and those fonts that irritated most of Germany. However, the German public responded even less favorably to the ideas of Herbert Bayer, a student and later a teacher of the Bauhaus, who held some even more radical views on typography, none of which were looked upon favorably by much of the German public, although some of his ideas made a lot of sense. And so fonts in classification share certain characteristics, including the shape or appearance of their serifs. Serif shapes include straight, rounded, pointed, and concave, and serifs were what were favored. So this idea of the serif was incredibly important. But Bayer, he says, why should we write and print in two alphabets? In other words, why should we have a large sign and a small sign, a capital and a lowercase and an uppercase? He says both a large sign and a small sign are not necessary to identify a sound, a single sound. We do not speak in capital A or in small a. A single alphabet gives us practically the same result as the mixture of upper and lower case. And at the same time, it is less of a burden on all who will write. And he had a lot of ideas around that. He disliked the use of serifs, the small lines that extended off of the letters, like in Times New Roman or Times. He found them wasteful and unnecessary. Germany at the time favored serif fonts and more complicated Goth fonts. Bayer employed those sans serif fonts in his work for the Bauhaus and his outside commissions. But the Bauhaus using this type of font was not new or solely supported by Bayer. But some of his other ideas caused even more trouble. And so he argued that once everyone got used to using all single case letters, things would be easier. It would be more economical, really. It would be more functional. Typing would be easier to master because you wouldn't have to hold the shift key down and make that uppercase. And faster to carry out since there would be no need for the shift key. By the typewriters, and they would also become more economical because they would be easier and cheaper to make since there would only be one case of letters that would be needed. He also discussed the possibility that commercial printing would be cheaper since typesetters wouldn't have to worry about multiple cases. They would have a single size, and that things would take up less space, saving paper and money and time. And in 1925, the Bauhaus decided to stop using capital letters in their printing. And there we have this lowercase, all lowercase, everything. So here's, on some levels, of course, we can look at this argument. We can say, yeah, that makes perfect sense. People could learn to read and write without uppercase letters. Things would eventually be simplified. But the amount of change that it would take at that time, in the 20th century, required an enormous effort. Just trying to break people of the habits who had already learned to write would take a tremendous amount of time and energy and would be met with heavy opposition almost everywhere. I have described what would happen in the United States if someone tried to convert the masses of this new way of writing in Germany. Things probably would be a lot worse. Here's some more of Herbert Bayer designs. The German public and German officials disliked the use of sans serif fonts by the Bauhaus, taking it as another break by the group that was already too far out for most of their liking and thinking. They became irritated with people at the Bauhaus at that, and that would eventually turned into outrage at the decision to stop using capital letters. In German, as in English, the beginning of sentences are capitalized, as are proper nouns. Beyond that, however, basically all nouns are capitalized in Germany. Attempting to change this in a society that strongly values tradition was not taken well or looked upon favorably. But it was this type of radical departure that defined the Bauhaus and part of what made its effects so very lasting. There's a card by the Bauhaus. When considering this departure from the standpoint of the English language, it does not seem as radical of a step, but considering it in German grammar and language, it really caused significant problems. So there's a few more of his cards. These are cards like inviting people like a ticket to an exhibition. And so Herbert Bayer designed letterhead, and here is the journal from the Bauhaus. And there, this is another very famous, and here we have a combination of photography and drawing, kind of all combined, these like forms. So very much like the forms that you'll see in my drawing class when you're doing, these like white shapes just to learn the shape of drawing. So this basic shape. There was also a wall painting workshop. The early interior decoration schemes for villas carried out by the workshop are difficult to classify. Choices of colors and the finish of the design neither correspond with later works, nor do they reflect our general knowledge or style of the 20s. They were completely different. We see a lot of gray and blue and lighter, very neutral colors. Despite this sometimes unusual color selection, as in the villas of Gropius and Meyer, the primacy of the architecture remains untouched. Vasily Kandinsky's appointment as master of form focused on the interest of these workshops on large-scale mural paintings and independent compositions from the actual wall. Kandinsky's room at the Jury-Free Art Exhibition in Berlin in 1922 and Oskar Schlemmer's murals in Weimar are seminal pieces within this development of wall painting. And in the late Weimar years and the early Dessau years, they led to a return to architecture-related decoration. Some designs tried to structure rooms with color accents to create defined areas within a room, but most of the rooms were very, very simple. He avoided, we have Heinrich Scherper. He avoids he becomes the head of the workshop in 1925, and he uses what he calls service decoration of architecture. He avoids choosing any bright colors, instead always uses light pastel tones, strengthened by a wide palette of different grays, warms and cool grays, very much like the kinds of designs that we see today. And here we are 100 years later. Color differentiation was such that structural architectural elements remained untouched. His classes were oriented towards craftsmanship. He demanded a very sophisticated color scale for oil painting that he devised, and he considered a founded knowledge of the different components of color to be as indispensable for professional know-how of how to look at materials. So you really needed to understand how colors interacted in order to choose them. Despite this focus on craftsmanship and design, Bauhaus wallpaper was developed in 1929 as an industrial product, and it was made for apartments and contemporary housing estates. It was one of the most successful products. I also want to look at Vasily Kandinsky's painting. Here's architecture had always been the goal of training for most of the painters, but there was also, this push towards experimentation and fine art. And here we see painting really move away from the object. So we don't have realistic imagery. We have shapes that are giving us feelings and color. To start with Feniger and Itten, and then we have Muke, Schlemmer, Clay, Kandinsky, and Moholy-Nagy. They guaranteed an outstanding artistic quality and a stylistic plurality, which was not to be found in any other school and has never been paralleled since that time. Feniger's crystalline architecture and landscape stood next to Schlemmer's statuary, futuristic human figures, and Clay's poetic world were next to kind of Kandinsky's abstraction. So this variety was amazing. And we know that Kandinsky many times thought of his paintings as music. He called them compositions and arrangements. He also had synesthesia, and that's where you hear color. And he had developed an entire kind of thinking about what color sounds like, like a flute versus a timpani drum and so on. And if we look at the movement in his abstract paintings, it really comes through. It's just quite beautiful. Instead of this, and parallel to their role as masters of form in the workshops, the artists were free to try out new paths in artistic basics. Right from the very start, a majority of students tried their hand at painting and drawing. Even in 1928, during the functionalist Dessau period, it was established with sort of astonishment that there are more painters at the Bauhaus than one might assume. Hans Meyer, school director after 1928, reacted to this trend by introducing free painting classes, so people could come in from the community and paint, and they were headed by Kandinsky and Clay. Can you imagine being able to come to a school and have Kandinsky as your teacher for free? The main goal was to critically observe the students' artistic production under the guidance of the masters in order to clarify the choice of materials and their relationship to what the statement should be. It was about conscious and independent creative work. And here we see one of Kandinsky's pieces with watercolors and India ink on cotton. So the watercolor in this piece is literally like absorbed into the cotton, and then once dry is gone over with the India ink, very much like some of the processes that we do. A workshop for printmaking existed only at the Bauhaus in Weimar. In 1921, Lionel Feniger was the artistic director and master craftsmanship with the lithographer Karl Zubitier. And so that was like what I'm talking about is etching and lithography. We don't see that later on. So here's a very early lithography of the School of the Weimar. And there we have all of our shapes. The first portfolio introduced the Bauhaus masters. The consecutive ones presented works by German, Italian, and Russian artists. A portfolio with French prints remained incomplete. The names of the artists lists were, incredible. They were Chagall to Schwitters, De Chirico, and Koschka, Archipenko to Severini, making clear the quality of this compendium of art prints from the 1920s. The printmaking workshop did not only produce these series and many individual sheets for the Bauhaus masters, it was equally available to students for their own works. In addition, the printmaking workshop also accepted commissions from the outside, for instance, for the printing of lithographs after works by people like Piet Mondrian and Alexander Rodochenko. He was a Russian constructivist. Also, the foundation for the future development of functional typography at the Bauhaus was laid with poster and typography designs for various events and publications at the school. This included the Bauhaus postcards, which found wide distribution as original graphic miniatures, and which, in their combination of typeface and image, were to become an important advertising medium for the Bauhaus. Here's a piece of sculpture. This was a chessboard, 1924. With cherry wood by Joseph Hartwig. During the Weimar period, the Bauhaus sustained two separate sculpture workshops, one for stone and one for wood. At first, Johannes Itten was in charge of both of them, and then later on, Oskar Schlemmer succeeded him. The sculptor Joseph Hartwig, who was to become famous principally for his purest Bauhaus chess set, was a master craftsman. Well in accordance with the programmatic guidelines of the Bauhaus that tends towards architecture, three-dimensional works for building was the main focus of the workshop. In 1921 to 1922, the wood carving workshops produced reliefs and wooden sculptures for the house designed by Walter Gropius and Adolf Meyer for the entrepreneur Adolf Sommerfeld in Berlin. The workshop for stone sculpture created wall decorations for both school buildings in the context of both large Bauhaus exhibitions at Weimar in the summer of 1923. And here's a free form sculpture created in both workshops. It was about commission too at that time. This one would have been out of limestone, 1922. A good example for these works is the architectural sculpture by Otto Werner. It's massive, together with the complex spatial layering of cubic elements, are reminiscent of contemporary forms from New Building, but evoke at the same time associations of that human figure. So it's almost like we have like a mesh of like the human form and the building form, the modern human. Next, I'm going to show you, it was a portfolio that was put together for Gropius and as a birthday gift to him. So the impulse for unique joint work presented itself to Walter Gropius by 6 of the Bauhaus masters, and it was for his 41st birthday, which occurred on May 18th, 1924. And the idea came from Laszlo Moholy-Nagy. He defined the theme with a photograph from the newspaper depicting the announcement of public wireless receivers of the results for the vote in Reichstag on May 4th, 1924. So this is like the kind of the beginning of what we later on see as the Third Reich. But here we have a phonograph that they called the wireless, and it's sending out, and there's like a crowd of people out listening to it, and it's in a window, and it's sending out information to people. So he asks 6 of the different Bauhaus masters to create an image with this as its theme for Gropius. And so here's the images they created. This one is Paul Klee. He had a very clever diagram of a failed information transfer. In other words, something stopped it. There's a bright red arrow symbolic of the message emerging from the megaphone, and it meets a very fragile ear and engenders on the other side of it a little green exclamation point. The message has been transmitted, even if only in a complementary color, and therefore transformed into its opposite. So obviously we have the red and the green. So there we have the complement. And it didn't really get through. It's like, I didn't really hear you. This one is Moholy-Nagy, and we transform the motif into a purely constructivist composition, paying no heed to the meaningful content. Falling diagonal marks mark on the 3 sides the kind of frame. Then the frame is kind of unstable, so it's kind of like the window frame. Receiver and sound projector become a square and a circle. The leafless tree of the photograph appears as a black cross with its negative projection in the form of a white inclined cross shape. Here's Vasily Kandinsky's idea, and there we see the dramatic composition shows a structure of colors and forms and forces sort of blowing out from the yellow triangle, sort of a relic of what the sound projector was, strikes out from the oblique windowsill toward the center. The diagonal movement, many times interrupted by transversal barriers, is resumed through bundles of lines which finally lose themselves in the upper left corner in the system of calmly suspended circles. Like there's the ideas, and I don't know if they're getting to the people. Fenninger finally transforms the image with soft irony into one of his characteristic marine scenes. He places the city dynamics within a moonlight kind of coastal landscape underwater. There's like a moon kind of on the top there. And the street signs is now a moon crescent. The transmitter is mutated into a little steamboat. And the sound projector is a huge cloud of steam. And George Mook hints at the confrontation of the apparatus with the listening crowd, thereby touching on the exploitation of this new wireless as mass media for politics. Because we've never seen this before. When you would go, when politicians would talk to people, they would do whistle stops. They'd go on a train, and people would gather at the stop, and then the politician would speak from the train, and they'd move to another one. But they saw the real person. In this case, it's just like people and this electronic thing. Countless black and colored little circles fill up the window opening and develop a disturbing energy which seems to surge forward and make everything else recoil from it. And that, my dears, is kind of the end of what we're going to look at for the Bauhaus.